Imagine waking up without an alarm, no phone buzzing, no radio blaring news, just the gradual awareness of light changing behind your eyelids, the slow realization that day has arrived, the natural rhythm of sunrise pulling you from sleep. This is how humans woke up for hundreds of thousands of years, and for most of that time, when you opened your eyes, you saw ice. Not metaphorically, not occasionally. Every single morning for generation after generation, stretching back further than any story could preserve, your ancestors woke to a world dominated by ice. Mile-thick glaciers covering entire continents, frozen wastelands where forests now grow, winters that lasted most of the year, summers barely warm enough to melt the surface snow, and then it ended, not gradually over millions of comfortable years, not in a way that gave species time to adapt at their leisure. The ice melted in the geological equivalent of an instant. 11,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, the world transformed so rapidly that human memory itself was fundamentally altered. The landscape changed so completely that every story, every map, every assumption about how the world worked had to be rewritten. Here's what makes this so strange, unsettling. Worth spending the next 2.5 hours exploring together. We call it the end of the Ice Age, as if it were a single event, as if one day there was ice and the next day there wasn't. But that's not what happened. What actually happened was far more complex, far more violent, and far more mysterious than the simple narrative of the world warmed up and the ice melted. Because the ice didn't just melt, it collapsed, it flooded. It created catastrophic events that would have seemed like the end of the world to anyone living through them. Sea levels rose so fast that coastal communities had to flee inland within a single generation. Rivers that had flowed in one direction for 10,000 years suddenly reversed course. Lakes larger than the modern countries appeared and disappeared in decades. And weather patterns shifted so dramatically that rain fell in deserts and drought came to rainforests. Your ancestors lived through this, they survived it. And in surviving it, they changed. Not just culturally, though that happened too, but psychologically, neurologically. The experience of living through such rapid environmental collapse left marks on human consciousness that we still carry today. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always check the comments and it's fascinating. Tokyo at dawn, Chicago at midnight, Amsterdam in the quiet hours before sunrise. All of us, lying in climate-controlled comfort, trying to imagine a world where the climate itself was the existential threat. Now, over the next 2.5 hours, we're going to walk through what actually happened when the Ice Age ended. Not the sanitized version you might have learned in school, where warming temperatures gradually melted ice and humans simply adapted. But the real version, the version where catastrophe piled on catastrophe, where humans watched their world literally transform beneath their feet, where survival required not just physical adaptation, but the ability to hold contradictory realities in mind simultaneously, that the world they knew was ending, but somehow life would continue. We're going to explore the specific moments when glaciers collapsed and created floods that would have drowned civilizations if civilizations had existed yet. We'll trace how sea levels rose not smoothly, but in terrifying pulses, each one erasing coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years. We'll examine how weather patterns went haywire, creating storms and droughts and phenomena that had no precedent in human experience. And we're going to ask questions that don't have comfortable answers. Questions about what it does to human psychology to live through environmental change so rapid you can see it happening within your own lifetime. Questions about how trauma gets encoded in culture when the trauma is planetary in scale. Questions about whether we still carry the psychological imprint of that ancient catastrophe. Whether some part of us still remembers when the world itself became unreliable. So get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. We're going back 11,000 years to the moment when everything changed, to the end of one world and the violent, chaotic birth of another. Picture this. It's 13,000 years ago. the last true maximum of the Ice Age, the moment of deepest cold, of maximum glaciation, of ice at its furthest extent. If you could stand at what will someday be Chicago, you'd be on top of a glacier 2 miles thick. The ice sheet covering North America extends from the Arctic Ocean to what will eventually be Kentucky. In Europe, glaciers flow south from Scandinavia, crushing everything beneath them. Asia has its own massive ice fields. Even parts of the southern hemisphere that we think of as warm are experiencing glaciation. The sea level is 400 feet lower than it will be in your time. The water that would fill the oceans is locked up in ice, in glaciers so vast they beg our imagination. The coastlines of every continent extend miles, sometimes hundreds of miles beyond where they'll eventually settle. You could walk from France to England, from Asia to Alaska, from Australia to what are now islands in Indonesia. Land bridges connect continents that will soon be separated by ocean. The climate is not just colder, it's different in ways that are hard to conceptualize. The jet stream flows in different patterns. Ocean currents follow different routes. Monsoons that will someday water billions of people don't exist yet. The Sahara, which will become a desert, is actually relatively wet during glacial periods due to shifted atmospheric circulation. Nothing is where it will be, nothing works the way it will work. And humans are here, have been here for hundreds of thousands of years. They're not primitive in the way we sometimes imagine. They have art, music, stories, complex social structures. They have adapted to this ice-dominated world with remarkable sophistication. They know how to survive in conditions that would kill unprepared modern humans in hours. But they're about to experience something they cannot possibly be prepared for, because the world is about to break. Here's what the simple version of events says happened next. The Earth's orbit shifted slightly. Sunlight hit the northern hemisphere at a different angle. Temperatures rose, the ice melted. Gradually, over thousands of years, the world warmed, and humans moved north, following the retreating glaciers. That's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in crucial ways. It's like saying World War II was a conflict that happened in the 1940s. Technically accurate, completely missing the actual experience. What really happened was far stranger, far more abrupt, far more catastrophic than the smooth warming curve we see in simplified climate graphs. Let me tell you about the Younger Dryas. The warming actually started around 15,000 years ago. Orbital mechanics changed the amount of summer sunlight hitting the northern hemisphere. The great ice sheets began to melt. Sea levels started to rise. Species began to migrate. After thousands of years of ice, the world was slowly warming, and then suddenly it stopped. Around 12,900 years ago, right in the middle of this warming trend, temperatures plunged back to near glacial conditions. Not gradually, not over centuries. Within decades, possibly within a single generation, the world slammed back into an ice age. The cooling was so rapid that it shows up as a sharp line in ice cores, so abrupt that forests in their prime froze and died standing. This is the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic flower that suddenly reappeared in European pollen records, a plant that only grows in tundra conditions. The flower's reappearance meant one thing: the tundra had returned. The ice was back. For 1,300 years the warming stopped. The glaciers that had been retreating began to advance again. The climate that had been improving became hostile again, and humans, who had been adapting to warmer conditions, had to adapt right back. Had to survive a whiplash climate change that would have been incomprehensible to anyone living through it. You might be wondering why. What caused this dramatic reversal? What could make the climate slam backwards after thousands of years of warming? The answer involves the Lake Agassiz, or rather, what happened to Lake Agassiz. Picture a lake larger than all the current Great Lakes combined, so large that it would dwarf many countries, so deep that in some places the bottom was hundreds of feet below what would become sea level. This lake existed in the center of North America, held in place by the melting Laurentide ice sheet that surrounded it. And one day, approximately 12,900 years ago, the ice dam holding it in place failed. Billions of gallons of fresh water, cold glacial meltwater, suddenly dumped into the North Atlantic, not gradually, not over years, in a catastrophic flood that would have been visible from space if there had been satellites to see it. A pulse of fresh water so massive it fundamentally altered ocean circulation. The North Atlantic current, which carries warm water from the tropics to northern Europe, depends on a delicate balance of salinity and temperature. The warm, salty water flows north, cools, becomes denser, sinks, and flows back south. This circulation keeps Europe warmer than it should be at its latitude. It's why London doesn't have the climate of Winnipeg, even though they're at the same latitude. But fresh water doesn't sink the same way salt water does. When Lake Agassiz dumped its contents into the North Atlantic, it created a massive layer of fresh water that disrupted the entire circulation pattern. The warm current from the tropics couldn't complete its cycle. Heat stopped flowing north, and temperatures across the northern hemisphere plummeted. This is what caused the Younger Dryas, a single catastrophic flood event changing ocean circulation and plunging the world back into Ice Age conditions for over a millennium. And here's the thing that should bother you, the thing that makes this relevant to you lying there tonight, safe in your bed, in your climate-controlled home. This wasn't some unique event in Earth's deep history. This is recent. This is within the span of human memory, or would have been, if humans had been writing things down. Your ancestors, people with brains identical to yours, with the same capacity for fear and hope and planning, lived through this. They watched the world warm. They adapted to warming conditions. They moved into new territories, developed new strategies, built lives based on the assumption that the warming would continue. And then the ice came back. Within their lifetimes, within a generation, everything they'd adapted to reversed. The warming they'd learned to trust ended. The world they thought they understood became incomprehensible again. Let's stay in that moment for a while. Let's really feel what this would have been like. You're a human living 12,900 years ago. Let's say you're in Europe, in what will someday be France. Your grandparents told you stories about the deep cold and about when ice covered everything. But in your lifetime, things have been getting better. The summers are longer, the winters are less brutal. Animals are moving north into territories they haven't occupied in thousands of years. Your people are following those animals, moving into new lands, finding new resources. This is all you've known. Warming, improvement, the gradual sense that the world is becoming more livable. You've built your life strategies around this assumption. You've planned migration routes. You've timed hunting expeditions. You've made decisions about where to establish seasonal camps based on the increasingly predictable patterns of warmth and cold. And then, within a decade or two, within your own adult life, everything changes. The summers start getting shorter again. The winters grow colder. The animals you've been following, they start moving south again, back into territories your people had left behind. The plants that had been creeping north, they die off. The landscape that had been opening up, it closes again. You don't have climatology, you don't have meteorology. You have no framework for understanding that ocean circulation has changed, that a massive influx of fresh water has disrupted the Atlantic current. All you know is that the warming has stopped, that the cold is back, that everything you'd learned about the improving world is suddenly obsolete. This is psychological warfare. This is the environment itself becoming unreliable. This is the betrayal of the one thing you thought you could count on, that climate trends, once established, continue. That the world, while dangerous, is at least consistent. Except now it's not consistent. Now it's revealed itself as fundamentally unstable, capable of rapid, incomprehensible reversals, and you have to live with that knowledge, have to make decisions about where to go, what to do, how to survive, while knowing that the ground rules can change without warning. Your culture has to adapt. Not just your hunting strategies or your clothing or your shelters. Your entire cosmology has to adapt. Your understanding of how the world works has to incorporate this new reality that nothing is stable, that improvement can reverse, that this world itself is not trustworthy. This is where human psychology starts to get really interesting, because the Younger Dryas lasted 1,300 years. Multiple human generations, entire lifetimes lived under the return of Ice Age conditions. But the memory of the warming didn't disappear. The knowledge that things had been better, that the world had been improving, that persisted. This created a kind of cultural schizophrenia. The lived reality was Ice Age conditions, but the cultural memory was of warming. The stories passed down were about a time when things were better, when the world was more generous, when humans could range more widely and resources were more abundant. This tension between remembered better times and current harsh conditions, it shows up in the archaeological record. There are sites that were occupied during the warming period, then abandoned during the Younger Dryas, then reoccupied after the Younger Dryas ended. There are evidence of resource stress, of population decline, of cultural simplification as humans focused on survival rather than innovation. But there's also evidence of resilience, of adaptation, of humans figuring out how to survive the whiplash, of communities that not only survived the cold return but found ways to thrive, or at least persist until warming resumed. And then, around 11,700 years ago, it did resume. The Younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it had begun. Within decades, possibly faster, temperatures shot back up. The warming trend that had been interrupted resumed. The ice began to melt again, this time for good. But now let's talk about what that melting actually looked like, because this is where the real catastrophes began. The ice sheets covering North America and Europe weren't solid, uniform structures. They were dynamic, flowing, constantly moving under their own weight. And they had been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. Mile-thick ice containing incomprehensible amounts of water, all of it locked in frozen form. When the final warming began, that ice started to melt from multiple directions simultaneously. From the top as summer temperatures rose, from the bottom as geothermal heat built up beneath the tremendous pressure, from the edges as they flowed into warmer regions, and sometimes, catastrophically, from the inside as meltwater channels carved through the ice, creating vast hollow spaces that would suddenly collapse. The melting wasn't smooth, it wasn't gradual. It happened in pulses, in surges, in catastrophic events that would release as much water in a few weeks as the entire Amazon River carries in a year. Let me give you a sense of scale. The Laurentide ice sheet covering North America contained enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by about 200 feet. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covering northern Europe contained enough for another 70 feet. Smaller ice sheets in Siberia, Greenland, Antarctica, and mountain regions around the world contained more. All of that ice, representing 400 feet of sea level rise, melted over approximately 10,000 years. That's an average of 4 to 5 feet per century, which doesn't sound too dramatic until you remember averages hide extremes. The melting wasn't steady at 4 to 5 feet per century. It happened in bursts. Sea level would be stable for a century or two, and then suddenly jump 20 or 30 feet within a few decades, then stabilize again, then jump again. The pattern wasn't predictable, the timing wasn't consistent, and each jump erased coastlines, drowned valleys, created new seas where there had been land. This is what humans experienced. Not a smooth transition from Ice Age to modern world, but a series of catastrophic pulses, each one creating conditions that would seem apocalyptic to anyone living through them. And here's what makes this psychologically fascinating. Each pulse was both unprecedented and impermanent. When sea levels jumped, people had to flee, had to abandon coastal settlements that might have been occupied for generations, had to move inland into territories that might already be occupied by other groups, had to adapt to new resources, new land use, new conditions. But the jumps didn't last forever. Eventually sea level would stabilize again. A new coastline would establish itself. And humans, being humans, would adapt, would move back toward the coast, would rebuild. would create new settlements based on the new normal, until the next pulse hit, and they'd have to flee again, abandon again, adapt again. Over and over, across hundreds of years, humans experience this cycle of catastrophe and recovery, catastrophe and recovery. This is where we start to see the development of something crucial to understanding human psychology: the ability to live with impermanence, the capacity to build, knowing that what you build might be destroyed, the willingness to invest in place while simultaneously maintaining the flexibility to abandon that place when conditions change. This psychological capacity, this ability to hold permanence and impermanence in mind simultaneously, it's still with us. It's part of how humans handle uncertainty, how we plan for the future while acknowledging that plans might need to change, how we commit to things while maintaining the flexibility to adapt when circumstances shift. Your ancestors learned this during the terminal ice age. They had no choice. The world itself was teaching them, through repeated catastrophe, that adaptation and resilience were more valuable than any fixed strategy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in the early stages of the melt. The Younger Dryas has just ended. The warming is resuming. The ice is starting to collapse in earnest. Let's walk through what this actually looked like on the ground, what it felt like, what it meant to be alive during the most rapid environmental transformation in human history. The first thing you'd notice is the water. Everywhere water. Rivers that had been frozen for generations suddenly flowing. Streams appearing where there had been only ice. Lakes forming in valleys as glaciers retreated and meltwater pooled. But this wasn't gentle spring melt. This was catastrophic discharge. Ice dams would hold back meltwater for years, decades, the pressure building, the water accumulating, and then suddenly the dam would fail and billions of gallons would surge through the landscape in hours or days. These weren't rivers, these were cataclysms, floods that would carve canyons hundreds of feet deep in solid bedrock. That would carry boulders the size of houses hundreds of miles from their origin. That would reshape entire landscapes, erasing old drainage patterns and creating new ones seemingly overnight. The channeled scablands in Washington state, the Great Missoula floods, the Baltic Ice Lake drainage. These weren't gradual processes. They were catastrophes, floods so massive they defy easy comprehension, and they happened over and over as ice dams formed and failed across thousands of years. If you were living near one of these ice dams when it failed, you would have perhaps a few hours warning. You'd hear it first, a distant rumbling, growing louder, and then you'd see it. A wall of water, mud, ice, and boulders advancing at speeds that would make running useless. Everything in its path would be scoured away. Everything. But here's the thing. Humans survived these floods. We know this because human artifacts from before the floods have been found in areas that were inundated, and human artifacts from after the floods show up in the same regions. People fled, people returned, people adapted. This meant maintaining constant awareness of glacial conditions, knowing where ice dams existed, watching for signs of stress, water seeping through ice, cracking sounds, changes in river levels, developing early warning systems, probably through networks of camps that could relay information, and most importantly, being ready to abandon everything and run when the warning came. This is survival at its most intense, not fighting an enemy you can see, not fleeing a predator you can track, but monitoring an environmental threat that could materialize without warning and could destroy everything in its path. Living with the knowledge that any day might be the day the dam breaks and you have hours to save yourself and nothing else. The psychological toll of this kind of existence is hard to overstate. Constant vigilance, constant readiness to flee, the inability to fully settle anywhere near a glacial boundary. The knowledge that the landscape itself is your enemy and your only defense is to stay alert and stay mobile. And this went on for thousands of years. Generation after generation of humans living on the edge of catastrophe. Watching glaciers retreat, yes, but also watching them create new dangers as they retreated. The melting wasn't liberation, It was a different kind of threat. As you're lying there tonight, perhaps you can begin to see why this matters. Why understanding what humans went through at the end of the Ice Age is relevant to understanding humans now. Because we still carry the psychology of impermanence, the capacity to build while knowing things might be destroyed, the ability to commit while remaining flexible, the tendency to monitor for threats even when none are immediately visible. These aren't modern anxieties, these are ancient adaptations, strategies that kept your ancestors alive when the world itself was unstable. When the environment was actively hostile, when the only constant was change and the only reliable strategy was readiness. But we're not done. We've covered the younger dryers, the resumption of warming, the catastrophic floods from melting ice. But there's more. Because as the ice melted and the water drained into the oceans, something else was happening. Something that would prove even more disruptive to human life than the floods. The coastlines were moving, rapidly, unpredictably, and with consequences that would reshape human civilization in ways we're still discovering. But that's for the next part of our journey. For now, just rest. Let these images settle in your mind. The ice 2 miles thick, the floods carrying boulders like leaves, the humans watching, adapting, surviving against odds that should have destroyed them. You come from survivors, from people who lived through the end of the world and kept going. That's in you, that resilience, that capacity to adapt, that willingness to face catastrophe and figure out how to persist through it. Tomorrow you can think about that. Tonight, you can just rest with the knowledge that your ancestors survived far worse than anything you're likely to face. And that survival, that persistence, that refusal to give up even when the world itself became unreliable, that's your inheritance. Sleep now, the Ice Age is ending, but the story is just beginning. Before we can understand the true scale of what happened, we need to go back to a moment that's hard for modern humans to conceptualize. A moment when the coastlines of Earth were fundamentally different from anything we know now. Picture yourself standing on what will someday be the edge of the North Sea. Except there is no North Sea, not yet. Where ocean should be, there's land. Flat, marshy, rich with game and edible plants. A landscape called Doggerland by the modern archaeologists, though it has no name in your time because the concept of naming landscapes hasn't really developed yet. This land connects what will be Britain to what will be continental Europe. It's not a narrow strip, it's vast, bigger than many modern countries, and it's not empty. Humans have lived here for thousands of years, generation after generation. Your people know every valley, every river, every good hunting ground. There are seasonal camps, sacred sites, places where particular medicinal plants grow, landmarks that feature in stories passed down through countless iterations. This is home, not in the modern sense of a fixed address, but in the deeper sense of a landscape that holds your entire existence. The territory where you were born, where your parents were born, where their parents were born, going back so far that no one can remember the beginning. And it's about to vanish beneath the sea. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic flood, though those will happen too, but in a process that will take centuries, each generation watching the sea advance a little further, the land shrink a little more until eventually there's no land left at all. Just water. Just the North Sea swallowing Doggerland completely, leaving only a few hilltops as islands that will be named Dogger Bank by people who have no idea they're standing on what were once mountains in a drowned world. This is what sea level rise looked like at the end of the Ice Age. And Doggerland was just one of many lands that vanished. All around the world, from Southeast Asia to the Mediterranean to the coasts of the Americas, the rising ocean was erasing landscapes that had been stable for thousands of years. Let's trace this. Let's understand exactly what happened to sea levels between 20,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago, because the numbers alone don't capture the human experience of watching your world drown. At the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago, sea level was approximately 400 feet lower than it is now in your time. 400 feet. That's the height of a 40-story building. The amount of coastal land that was exposed, that humans could live on, That's hard to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest an area larger than the continental United States. All of it gone, drowned, transformed from land into ocean floor. But it didn't happen smoothly, and that's crucial to understanding what humans experienced. From 20,000 to 15,000 years ago, not much happened. The ice was at maximum extent. Temperatures were stable, if bitterly cold. Sea levels barely budged. Human populations living on the coasts, and many were coastal because coastlines offer abundant resources, they experienced no significant changes within their lifetimes. Then the warming began, and from 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, sea levels started to rise, not dramatically, maybe 30 to 40 feet total over 2,000 years. That's about 1.5 feet per century. Noticeable within a long lifetime, but not catastrophic. A grandfather might remember the sea being a little farther away. A great-grandfather's stories might mention landmarks that were now underwater. But it was slow enough that adaptation was possible. Communities could move their seasonal camps back a bit, adjust their routes, adapt, and then the Younger Dryas hit. From 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, sea level rise stopped completely, actually reversed slightly in some regions as glaciers advanced again. For 1,200 years, the coastline stabilized. Humans who had been retreating inland stopped retreating, established new settlements at what seemed like a stable shoreline, began to think perhaps that the rising water was finished, that this was the new normal. They were wrong. When the Younger Dryas ended 11,700 years ago, the warming resumed with a vengeance. And this time there was no pause, no reversal, just relentless, accelerating warming and ice melt, and sea level rise that would transform the entire planet. Between 11,700 and 8,000 years ago, sea level rose approximately 200 feet. 200 feet in less than 4,000 years. That's an average of 5 feet per century, which is already dramatic. But remember what I said before, averages hide extremes. The rise wasn't steady, it happened into pulses, and some of those pulses were catastrophic. Let me tell you about Meltwater Pulse 1A. Around 14,500 years ago, during the first warming period before the Younger Dryas, something happened, something so large in scale that it shows up as a distinct spike in every sea level record we have from around the world. Sea level jumped approximately 50 feet in less than 500 years. 50 feet. In 500 years or less. Some researchers think it might have been even faster, 50 feet in 100 years. That's 6 inches per year. Half a foot of sea level rise annually, sustained for a century. To give you perspective, in your time in the modern world, sea level is rising at about 1/8 of an inch per year, and it's considered a global crisis. During Meltwater Pulse 1A, the rate was 48 times faster. What caused this? The collapse of a major ice sheet, probably the Antarctic ice sheet, though the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets were also disintegrating rapidly. Somewhere, a vast amount of ice that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly wasn't stable anymore. It melted, it collapsed into the ocean, and sea levels around the entire world jumped in response. Now picture yourself as a human living through this. You're on a coastline, maybe in Southeast Asia, in this region that will someday be called Sunda, but which is currently a vast subcontinent connecting Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Or maybe you're in Doggerland, or along what will become the Mediterranean. Location doesn't matter. The sea level rise was global. You've noticed the sea getting closer. Your grandparents' camps are underwater now, but it's been gradual, manageable. Your people have adapted by moving their settlements back from the shore. No catastrophe, just slow change. And then, over the course of your lifetime, the pace accelerates. Suddenly the sea is advancing not inches per year, but feet. Coastal areas that were above water when you were a child are deep underwater by the time you're middle-aged. The rate of change is visible now. You can see it happening. This creates a psychological crisis. Because humans plan. We make assumptions about the future based on observed patterns. We invest in places, build structures, establish territories, create sacred sites. All of this requires some baseline assumption that the landscape will remain stable, but now the landscape is actively changing. Landmarks are disappearing underwater. Territories are shrinking. The mental map of the world that you carry in your head, that your culture carries in its collective memory, that map is becoming obsolete in real time, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. This isn't an enemy you can fight. It's not a predator you can avoid. It's not even a flood you can flee and then return when it's over. This is permanent transformation. The land is disappearing and it's not coming back. This requires a complete reorganization of how you think about place, about permanence, about home. Your culture has to develop new strategies, not just for dealing with the physical reality of rising water, but for dealing with the psychological reality of impermanence on a scale that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. Let's zoom in on one specific region, Doggerland, because it's well studied and because its story captures something universal about what happened to coastal peoples during this period. Doggerland at its maximum extent was about the size of modern Britain. It was low-lying, marshy in places, but with rivers, hills, forests. It was prime habitat for game animals, rich in fish, home to edible plants, an ideal environment for Mesolithic hunters and gatherers. Archaeological evidence suggests continuous human occupation of Doggerland from at least 12,000 years ago, probably much earlier. The people who lived there weren't nomadic in the modern understanding of the term. They had seasonal rounds, yes, following game and plant resources, but they returned to the same places year after year. They knew the land intimately. They had names for places, though we'll never know what those names were. And then the sea began to rise. At first, it would have been the lowest lying areas, the marshy regions near what would become the centre of the North Sea. These areas flood first, become tidal, transform from solid ground into mud flats that are only accessible at low tide. The people living there retreat, move to higher ground. This is manageable. Unfortunate, perhaps. They've lost some good hunting grounds, but there's still plenty of land. They adapt. But the sea keeps rising. And it's not just covering the low areas now, it's advancing into what have been highlands. What have been permanent camps now flood seasonally, then annually, then they're underwater permanently. The retreats become more frequent. Every generation, it seems, has to abandon more territory, move further inland, compress into smaller and smaller areas, and as Doggerland shrinks, the human population has to make difficult choices. Some move to what will become Britain. Some move to what will become the European continent. The populations divide, perhaps reluctantly, as the land between them shrinks to a narrow strip, then to a series of islands, then to nothing at all. By about 8,500 years ago, Doggerland is mostly gone. By 6,500 years ago, it's completely submerged. The landscape that had supported human life for thousands of years is now the bottom of the North Sea. The only traces are archaeological sites discovered by modern fishing trawlers, artifacts pulled up from the seafloor, proof that people once lived on what is now open ocean. This same story played out around the world. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf was exposed during the Ice Age, connecting the mainland to islands that are now separated by hundreds of miles of ocean. As sea levels rose, this vast region was progressively drowned. The populations that had lived there were forced into increasingly crowded conditions on shrinking land masses, eventually becoming the island populations we see today. In the Mediterranean, the coastlines looked completely different. The Adriatic Sea was partly dry land. The Black Sea was much smaller. Islands that are now separate were connected, and as the waters rose, populations were squeezed into smaller territories, forced to compete for dwindling resources. In the Americas, the Bering Land Bridge that had connected Asia to Alaska was submerged. The coastal populations along both the Atlantic and Pacific were pushed inland. The Channel Islands off California were once hilltops in a much larger landmass. There are now isolated islands because the valleys between them filled with water. Every coastline on Earth experienced this. Every human population living near the ocean watched their territory shrink. and the psychological and cultural implications are staggering. Because this wasn't just about losing land, it was about losing all the meaning embedded in that land. The sacred sites were underwater. The places featured in origin stories were gone. The landmarks that oriented navigation were submerged. The graves of ancestors were beneath the waves. This meant that cultural memory itself had to adapt. Stories couldn't rely on go to the place where the river bends, because that place was now 200 feet underwater. Navigation couldn't use coastal landmarks that no longer existed. Territorial boundaries couldn't be defined by features that had been drowned. Some cultures developed flood myths, stories of a time when the world was different, when land extended farther, when ancestors lived in places that are now ocean. These stories appear in cultures around the world. The details differ, but the core narrative is often similar. There was a great flooding, the old world was drowned, the survivors had to adapt to a new world. We used to think these were purely mythological, metaphorical stories about divine punishment or cosmic renewal. But increasingly archaeologists and anthropologists think they might be cultural memories of real events, of the actual rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, of watching the world drown and having to preserve that memory through story. This makes sense when you think about it. These weren't abstract events. They were lived experiences, repeated over hundreds of generations. Each generation watching the sea advance, hearing from elders about how much farther the land used to extend, passing that knowledge to their children who would witness even more dramatic changes. The stories might have become mythologized over time, details might have shifted, but the core memory that the world was once larger, that a great deal of land was lost to rising water, that this transformation forced people to flee and adapt, that memory would have been powerful enough to persist. And here's where it gets really interesting for understanding human psychology. Because these stories don't just preserve facts, they preserve feelings. The emotional texture of living through catastrophic change. The fear, the loss, the displacement, but also the resilience, the adaptation, the determination to survive. When you hear flood myths from different cultures, the biblical flood, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, Aboriginal Australian stories of the sea rising, Pacific Islander legends of submerged lands, you're potentially hearing echoes of real trauma, real experiences of environmental catastrophe, filtered through thousands of years of retelling, but still carrying the emotional weight of the original events. This is cultural memory operating at a level deeper than conscious recall. It's the collective unconscious, if you want to use Jung's term. Or more materially, it's the persistence of trauma responses through cultural transmission. The stories encode not just what happened, but how it felt to live through it. And this matters because it suggests that humans today might still be carrying psychological adaptations from this period. The anxiety about environmental change, the tendency to see rising waters as inherently threatening, the cultural emphasis on stories about floods and drowning. These might not be random, they might be the distant echoes of real catastrophes that shaped human cultures during the most rapid environmental transformation our species has ever experienced. But let's return to the physical reality. Because the story of sea level rise isn't finished. We've covered meltwater pulse 1a around 14,500 years ago, but there was at least one more major pulse. And this one might have been even more catastrophic. Around 8,200 years ago, there's evidence of another sudden sea level jump. Not as large as pulse 1a, maybe 10 to 15 feet rather than 50, but still catastrophic for coastal populations who had resettled after the earlier pulses. This event is linked to the final drainage of Lake Agassiz and Lake Ojibwe, massive glacial lakes in North America that had been held in place by the retreating Laurentide ice sheet. When the ice dam finally failed completely, the lakes drained into Hudson Bay and from there into the North Atlantic, releasing enough fresh water to raise global sea levels and once again disrupting the Atlantic Ocean circulation. The climate impacts were significant. The North Atlantic current weakened, temperatures dropped across northern Europe and parts of North America, but the sea level rise was the truly transformative event. For coastal populations that had spent thousands of years adapting to the new shorelines, watching their territories shrink, this must have felt like the final betrayal. Just when things had stabilized, just when the rate of sea level rise had slowed enough that people could plan for the future, another pulse hit. Another round of flooding, another forced migration inland. And this time there was less room to retreat. The interior lands were already occupied by other groups who had moved inland during earlier phases. The coastal populations weren't just losing territory, they were being compressed into increasingly crowded conditions, forced into competition for resources with groups who had different cultural practices, different languages, different territorial claims. This is how environmental catastrophe creates social conflict. The rising seas didn't just drown land, they created refugee crises, forced groups into contact who had previously been separated, created competition for resources in regions that were already at carrying capacity. Some archaeological evidence suggests this period saw an increase in violence. Fortified settlements start appearing, mass graves with signs of trauma, evidence of territorial conflict. This could be coincidence. Or it could be the predictable result of too many people competing for too little land in the wake of environmental catastrophe. The survivors, the ones who made it through this period, they developed new cultural strategies. More emphasis on mobility, perhaps, knowing that no settlement was truly permanent. More sophisticated trade networks to access resources from wider areas. More complex social hierarchies to manage competition for scarce resources. More elaborate stories and myths to maintain cultural cohesion, even as physical territories shifted. This is the human capacity for adaptation at its most impressive. Faced with environmental change that would seem apocalyptic, humans didn't just survive, they innovated. They created new societal, new social structures. They developed new technologies. They found ways not just to persist, but to eventually thrive in the post-glacial world. But the cost was real. Entire landscapes lost. Entire populations displaced. Cultural knowledge that depended on now submerged geography becoming obsolete. The trauma of watching your world literally drown generation after generation. As you're lying there tonight, think about what this means. Your ancestors, people with brains identical to yours, with the same capacity for planning and emotion and cultural memory. They lived through this. They watched 400 feet of sea level rise transform the entire planet. They adapted to changes more rapid and more dramatic than anything humans in recorded history have experienced. And they survived. Not easily, not without loss. But they survived. They found ways to maintain cultural continuity even as physical landscapes disappeared. They preserved memories of the lost lands through stories. They developed psychological resilience in the face of environmental catastrophe that would break less adaptable species. You carry that resilience, that capacity to adapt to dramatic change, that ability to lose everything familiar and still find ways to continue. It's not just metaphorical, it's encoded in your cultural inheritance, passed down through thousands of generations from people who lived through the end of the Ice Age and refused to give up. The rising seas eventually stopped. By about 6,000 years ago, sea levels had stabilized close to where they are now in your time. The coastlines finally settled into configurations that would persist for thousands of years. The trauma of constant environmental upheaval finally ended, but the memory remained, in flood myths, in cultural practices that emphasize mobility and flexibility, in psychological patterns that made humans cautious about environmental change, in the deep understanding that the world itself cannot be fully trusted to remain stable. This is your inheritance. From people who watched the world transform beneath their feet and found ways to transform themselves in response, who lost their homelands to the rising ocean and still maintained their humanity, who faced catastrophe after catastrophe and still chose to continue, to have children, to pass on their knowledge and stories to the next generation. Tomorrow you can think about what that means. Tonight, you can rest in the knowledge that you come from survivors of environmental catastrophe on a scale that the modern world hasn't seen. That survival, that resilience, that refusal to be destroyed by circumstances beyond control, that's what made you possible. Sleep now, the seas have risen, the old world is drowned. But life continues, it always continues. Because humans, for all their vulnerability, are also extraordinarily difficult to destroy. Think about the last time you felt truly disoriented. Maybe you woke up in an unfamiliar place and for a moment couldn't remember where you were. Maybe you returned to a childhood neighborhood and found everything changed beyond recognition. That moment when your mental map of reality doesn't match what you're experiencing, when nothing is where it should be. Now multiply that feeling by everything, every aspect of your environment, every assumption about how the world works, every piece of knowledge about where to find food, water, shelter, all of it, wrong, obsolete, useless. This is what happened to humans at the end of the Ice Age. And we've only talked about the ice melting and the seas rising. That was just the beginning. Because when you fundamentally alter the planet's ice coverage, when you add billions of tons of fresh water to the oceans, when you change the albedo of the entire northern hemisphere by replacing white ice with dark land, you don't just change geography, you change everything. The weather patterns that had been stable for thousands of years, they shifted. The ocean currents that had flowed in predictable paths for millennia, they reorganized. The jet stream, that river of wind in the upper atmosphere that determines where storms go and where droughts happen, it moved. And when the jet stream moves, when ocean currents change, when atmospheric circulation reorganizes, every climate on Earth transforms. The Sahara, which had been relatively wet during glacial periods, began to dry out. What would become one of Earth's largest deserts was still green during the early Holocene, supporting human populations, large animals, extensive vegetation. But as the ice melted and atmospheric patterns shifted, the monsoons that had watered North Africa began to weaken, and slowly, inexorably, the desert expanded. Humans living there watched their world transform, not through rising water this time, but through the opposite, through drying, through the slow disappearance of the lakes and rivers and vegetation that had made life possible, through the gradual realization that the rains that had always come were becoming less reliable, that the grass was thinning, that the animals were leaving, that what had been paradise was becoming uninhabitable. By about 5,000 years ago, the Sahara had completed its transformation from green savanna to arid desert. The populations that had lived there were forced to migrate to the margins, to the river valleys like the Nile where water still flowed. This concentration of population along rivers, this forced reorganization of human settlement patterns, it set the stage for the development of complex societies. The ancient Egyptian civilization Mesopotamian city-states. These emerged in part because environmental change had compressed populations into narrow habitable zones. But that's getting ahead. We're still in the immediate aftermath of Ice Age, in the period when weather patterns were in flux, when no one could predict what would happen next, when every assumption about climate was being tested and often proven wrong. Let's move to another region, South America, the Amazon basin. During the Ice Age, the Amazon had been much drier than it is in your time. The rainforest was fragmented, broken up into isolated pockets separated by savanna and grassland. But as the ice melted and atmospheric circulation changed, the moisture patterns shifted. The Amazon began to receive more rainfall, much more. The fragmented forest pockets expanded, connected, grew into the vast unbroken rainforest that exists in your time. This sounds positive, and in many ways it was. The expanded forest supported more biodiversity, more resources, more potential for human habitation. But for the humans living there during the transition, this wasn't simple improvement. This was radical transformation of the entire ecosystem. Animals that had adapted to open grassland found their habitat shrinking, being replaced by dense forest. Plants that had thrived in drier conditions were being crowded out by moisture-loving species. The entire food web was reorganizing, and humans, who had developed strategies for living in a mixed environment of forest and grassland, had to rapidly adapt to an increasingly forested landscape. This required new technologies, new hunting techniques for forest animals versus grassland animals, new plant processing methods for forest resources, new social organizations for people living in more dispersed patterns through dense forest rather than more concentrated patterns on open grassland. Everything changed. And change, even positive change, is difficult. The same pattern played out globally. In Australia, the end of the Ice Age brought increased monsoon activity to the north, while the interior became more arid. In North America, the retreat of glaciers created entirely new ecosystems in regions that had been under ice. The Great Lakes formed as glacial meltwater pooled in depressions carved by the ice. New forests spread across landscapes that had been tundra. Animals and humans followed these expanding forests, colonizing territories that had been uninhabitable for thousands of years. Each of these changes created opportunities, but each also required adaptation, required learning new landscapes, new resources, new strategies, and the changes were happening fast enough that a single human lifetime might span multiple ecosystem transformations. Imagine being born in a world that's half tundra, half boreal forest. You learn the tundra, you understand its rhythms, its resources, its dangers, you become expert in tundra survival, and then, by the time you're middle-aged, the tundra is gone, replaced by forest. Everything you learned about finding food, avoiding danger, reading weather signs, much of it is now obsolete. And you have to start over, learn forest skills, adapt to forest resources, become expert in a completely different environment. This isn't hypothetical. This happened to human populations across northern Europe and Asia as the glaciers retreated. The archaeological record shows sudden shifts in tool types, hunting strategies, settlement patterns. Not because a new group of people arrived, but because the existing populations had to rapidly adapt to radically changing environments. And remember, this is happening simultaneously with the sea level changes we discussed earlier. So you're not just dealing with climate shift, you're dealing with climate shift and coastal flooding. Your territory is shrinking from the rising ocean, while simultaneously transforming from tundra to forest. The resources you depend on are changing while the land you depend on is disappearing. Multiple catastrophes, all at once. The psychological stress of this multi-layered transformation is hard to overstate, because humans need stability. We need to be able to plan, to use knowledge from the past to navigate the present and prepare for the future. But when the present keeps changing faster than knowledge can accumulate, when the past becomes an unreliable guide, when planning becomes impossible because conditions next year might be completely different from this year, that creates cognitive strain. This is where cultural flexibility becomes crucial. The human populations that survived this period weren't the ones with the most specific, specialized knowledge. They were the ones with the most adaptable knowledge. The ones who could learn new skills quickly, who could abandon strategies that no longer worked and adopt new ones, who could maintain social cohesion even as the physical environment became unreliable. This required particular cognitive abilities, the capacity to hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously, the willingness to abandon expertise and become a novice again, the ability to learn from others who might have knowledge from different regions or different ecosystems, the flexibility to change core assumptions about how the world works. These abilities, this cognitive flexibility in the face of environmental uncertainty, this is part of your inheritance. Modern humans are exceptionally good at adapting to new conditions, better than any other species, and that ability was forged during the terminal ice age, when environmental change was so rapid and so dramatic that only the most flexible population survived. But let's talk about another transformation that was happening simultaneously, one that's even more dramatic and more visible in the archaeological record: the disappearance of the megafauna. During the Ice Age, the world was full of giants: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. giant beavers the size of modern bears, enormous elk with antler spans of 12 feet, cave bears, cave lions, woolly rhinoceros. North America alone had more than 50 species of large mammals that are now extinct. And they were large. The mammoths weren't just a bit bigger than modern elephants. They were massive, some species standing 14 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing 10 tons. The giant ground sloths stood at 20 feet tall when upright. The glyptodonts, giant armadillos, were the size of small cars. These weren't just animals. They were landscape features, ecological engineers that shape their environments through their feeding, their movement, their sheer physical presence. Humans had lived alongside these animals for thousands of years, had hunted them, yes, but also avoided them, studied them, incorporated them into mythologies and stories. The megafauna were part of the Ice Age world, part of what made it different from what came after. And between about 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, they disappeared. Not all of them. Some megafauna survived, bison, elk, bears, but the vast majority went extinct. And they went extinct in a pattern that's still being debated by scientists. In the Americas, the extinctions were sudden and severe. More than 80% of large mammal species disappeared. In Australia, similar massive die-offs. In Europe and Asia, the pattern was less severe but still dramatic, and the timing corresponded with the end of the Ice Age. What caused this? 3 main theories, and the truth is probably some combination of all 3. Theory 1. Climate change. The megafauna had adapted to Ice Age conditions, cold, dry grasslands, specific vegetation patterns, particular seasonal rhythms. When the climate warmed and these conditions changed, the megafauna couldn't adapt fast enough. Their populations crashed and they went extinct. Theory 2. Human hunting. Humans with improving technology and hunting strategies hunted the megafauna to extinction. This is called the overkill hypothesis. The evidence is mixed. Some sites show extensive megafauna hunting. Others show little evidence that humans targeted these animals. Theory 3. Combined stress. The megafauna were already stressed by climate change. Their populations were declining, their habitats shrinking. And then human hunting, even at sustainable levels in normal times, became unsustainable when populations were already weak. The combination of climate stress and human predation proved fatal. Whichever theory is correct, and again, it's probably some combination, the result was the same. The megafauna disappeared. And with them went an entire way of life for human populations that had depended on them. Think about what this meant. If you're a human whose culture has revolved around mammoth hunting for hundreds of generations, whose tools are designed for taking down mammoths, whose social structures are organized around mammoth hunts, whose stories and myths feature mammoths as central characters, the extinction of mammoths isn't just an environmental change, it's a cultural catastrophe. You have to develop entirely new hunting strategies, new tools, new social organizations, new prey animals that require different techniques, and you have to do this while simultaneously dealing with rising sea levels and changing climate and transforming vegetation. The compounding stresses are enormous. Some human populations successfully transitioned. They shifted from megafauna hunting to hunting smaller, more diverse prey. They developed new technologies, fish traps, nets, more sophisticated projectile points for smaller game. They reorganized their social structures to match the new resource base. But the transition wasn't easy. There's evidence of population decline in some regions during this period. Possible nutritional stress as people struggled to replace the calories that megafauna hunting had provided. Sites that had been occupied for thousands of years were abandoned. This suggests some populations didn't successfully make the transition. The ones who did survive developed a new relationship with the environment, less focused on single large prey species, more diverse, more flexible, more opportunistic. This diversification of subsistence strategies is characteristic of what archaeologists call the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age between the Ice Age and the development of agriculture. And here's something fascinating. The megafauna extinctions might have been traumatic, but they also opened niches. With the giant herbivores gone, smaller species populations expanded, ecosystems reorganized, and humans, being opportunistic omnivores, were well positioned to take advantage of this reorganization. This is a pattern we see repeatedly. Environmental catastrophe creates opportunity alongside loss. The key is flexibility, the ability to recognize and exploit new opportunities rather than rigidly clinging to old strategies that no longer work. But let's return to the weather. Because while we've talked about regional changes, Sahara drying, Amazon wetting, megafauna dying, we haven't fully addressed the global atmospheric reorganization that was happening. The jet stream, that fast-flowing river of air in the upper atmosphere, its position determines where storms track and where high-pressure systems park. During the Ice Age, the jet stream was pushed south by the presence of massive ice sheets. This brought storms and moisture to regions that are now deserts, while the regions that are now temperate were frozen. As the ice melted, the jet stream migrated north, and as it moved, it dragged the storm tracks with it. Regions that had received reliable rainfall for thousands of years suddenly found themselves in drought. Regions that had been dry suddenly experienced storms. This reorganization happened over centuries, but the impacts on human populations were dramatic. Agriculture, which was just beginning to develop in some regions around 10,000 years ago, depended critically on predictable rainfall patterns. But the rainfall patterns weren't predictable. They were in flux, reorganizing, creating conditions that made early agriculture incredibly risky. The first farmers weren't just experimenting with domestication. They were gambling that the rain would continue to come in the right amounts at the right times. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. Failed harvests, famines, population movements as groups followed the shifting patterns of reliable rainfall. This instability lasted for thousands of years after the Ice Age officially ended. The climate continued to oscillate, warm periods alternating with cold periods, wet alternating with dry. The 8,200-year event we mentioned earlier was one of these oscillations. There were others. The climate didn't fully stabilize until about 5,000 years ago. This means that for 7,000 years after the Ice Age ended, humans were living in a world where environmental conditions were fundamentally unstable, where assumptions about climate couldn't be trusted, where planning for the future was difficult because the future might bring conditions completely different from the present. This created selection pressure for particular psychological traits, risk assessment, probabilistic thinking, the ability to plan for multiple scenarios simultaneously, the willingness to maintain options rather than committing fully to single strategies. All of these became valuable in a world where environmental reliability couldn't be taken for granted. And these traits developed under conditions of extreme environmental uncertainty. They are still with you. Modern humans are exceptionally good at risk assessment, at planning for multiple contingencies, at maintaining flexibility in the face of uncertainty. We think this is just how humans are, but it's how humans became under specific environmental pressures during the terminal Ice Age and early Holocene. As you're lying there tonight, perhaps you can see how all of these pieces fit together. The melting ice or the rising seas, the reorganizing climate, the megafauna extinctions, the transforming ecosystems. None of these happened in isolation. They were all parts of one massive interconnected planetary transformation. And humans lived through it, not as passive victims, but as active participants, making choices, adapting strategies, learning new skills, maintaining cultural continuity, even as the physical world became unrecognizable. Somehow finding ways to pass knowledge to the next generation, even when that knowledge was becoming obsolete before it could be fully learned. This is the resilience we talked about earlier. But it's not just resilience, it's creativity. It's the capacity to innovate under pressure, to see new possibilities in catastrophic change, to transform yourself as the world transforms around you. Your ancestors who survived the end of the Ice Age didn't just endure, they evolved. Not genetically, that takes too long, but culturally, psychologically. They became people who could handle rapid change, who could learn new environments quickly, Who could abandon old certainties and embrace new realities? Who could live with chronic uncertainty and still maintain hope? Still plan for the future? Still choose to have children who would inherit an unpredictable world? This is your inheritance. From people who watched their world transform in every possible way and still found reasons to continue, who faced compounding catastrophes and still found ways to adapt, who lost almost everything familiar and still maintained their humanity. The Great Transformation eventually ended. The climate stabilized. The sea levels stopped rising. The ecosystems settled into new configurations that would persist for thousands of years. The age of catastrophic environmental change gave way to a period of relative stability that allowed agriculture, cities, civilizations to develop. But the memory remained. In flood myths, in stories of lost golden ages, in cultural practices that emphasize flexibility and adaptation, in psychological patterns that made humans perpetually alert to environmental change, in the deep knowledge, passed down through countless generations, that the world itself cannot be fully trusted to remain stable. Tomorrow you can think about what this means for understanding modern human anxieties about environmental change. Tonight, you can rest in the knowledge that your ancestors survived environmental transformations more rapid and more dramatic than anything recorded history has witnessed. And that survival wasn't just physical, it was cultural. It was the preservation of knowledge, of stories, of humanity itself through conditions that should have destroyed everything. Sleep now. The world has stabilized. The Great Transformation is over. The ice has melted. The seas have risen. The climate has reorganized. The megafauna are gone. But humans remain. Still adaptable, still resilient, still capable of facing catastrophe and finding ways to continue. That capacity lives in you. In every adaptation you make to changing circumstances. In every time you learn something new because old knowledge is no longer sufficient. In every moment you choose to continue despite uncertainty about what comes next. You come from people who survived the end of one world and the violent birth of another. That survival, that adaptation, that refusal to give up even when everything familiar was disappearing, that's what made you possible. Rest now. The ancient transformations are complete. But the story of human resilience, that story continues. In you, in everyone trying to navigate a world that never stops changing. In the eternal human capacity to adapt, to learn, to persist, to survive. Here's where ancient programming meets modern reality. We think of agriculture as humanity's great triumph. The moment when we stopped being nomadic hunter-gatherers and became settled farmers. The foundation of civilization. The beginning of everything we recognize as complex human society. Children's books show it as a happy discovery. A wise ancestor noticing that seeds grow into plants, having the brilliant idea to plant them deliberately, and suddenly everyone's farming and life is better. Progress, innovation, human ingenuity winning the day. But what if that's completely wrong? What if agriculture wasn't a triumph at all? What if it was a desperate response to crisis? What if the development of farming wasn't humans reaching for progress, but humans scrambling to survive in a world that had stopped providing? This is the perspective that's emerging from recent archaeological and anthropological research. And it changes everything about how we understand the transition from the Ice Age to the world we know. It changes how we think about civilization itself, about progress, about the entire trajectory of human history. Because here's what the evidence actually shows. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were hunter-gatherers, and they were good at it. Very good. Exceptionally successful at an adaptation that sustained populations through dramatic environmental changes, including multiple ice ages. The archaeological evidence is clear on this point. Ice Age hunter-gatherers were healthier than the early farmers who came after them. Skeletal remains show they were taller, stronger, had better teeth, fewer signs of nutritional deficiency. Their bones show less evidence of hard physical labour. Their graves show fewer signs of violent death, at least in many regions. Their diets were more diverse. Analysis of Ice Age sites shows consumption of dozens of different plant species, multiple types of game, fish, shellfish, birds, a nutritionally complete diet drawn from wild resources, no dependence on a few domesticated crops, no vulnerability to single crop failures. And perhaps most surprisingly, their work hours were fewer. Modern studies of remaining hunter-gatherer societies suggest they work about 3 to 5 hours per day on average to meet their subsistence needs. The rest of the time is available for social activities, crafts, storytelling, rest. It's not the desperate hand-to-mouth existence we imagine. Hunter-gathering, when resources are adequate, is actually a relatively leisurely way of life. You work when you need to, or you rest when you don't. You move when resources in one area are depleted, and settle when you find abundance. There's flexibility, there's variety, there's freedom of movement. So why did it end? Why did humans, who had successfully hunted and gathered for hundreds of thousands of years, suddenly start farming around 10,000 years ago in multiple locations around the world? The traditional answer, the one you probably learned, is simple. Farming was obviously better. More food production, more security, more ability to support larger populations. Humans invented agriculture and immediately adopted it because it was clearly superior to hunting and gathering. Linear progress from primitive to advanced. But the evidence doesn't support this narrative at all. In fact, it contradicts it at every level. Early agriculture was hard, much harder than hunting and gathering. It required constant repetitive labour, clearing land by hand with stone tools, breaking soil, planting seeds one by one, constant weeding to prevent wild plants from overwhelming crops, protecting fields from animals, harvesting, processing grain, which is incredibly labour-intensive before you have mills. And this labour had to happen on schedules dictated by crops, not by human preference. You plant when the season is right, not when you feel like it. You harvest when the crop is ready, even if it means working sunrise to sunset for weeks. You're tied to the agricultural calendar in ways that constrain freedom. Agriculture tied people to specific locations. You can't move your fields. Once you've invested labour in clearing land and planting, you're committed to that place. Hunter-gatherers could follow resources, move to avoid conflicts, relocate when conditions changed. Farmers were stuck, and agriculture created dependence on a few domesticated species rather than the diverse wild resources that hunter-gatherers used. Early farmers in the Middle East depended primarily on wheat and barley. In China, millet and rice. In Mesoamerica, maize and beans. Maybe 5 to 10 crop species instead of the 50 to 100 wild species that hunter-gatherers utilized. This dependence created vulnerability. A crop failure meant famine. A disease affecting your primary crop meant disaster. Bad weather at the wrong time could destroy an entire year's food supply. Hunter-gatherers, with their diverse resource base, rarely faced this kind of vulnerability. If one resource failed, dozens of others remained. And the health impacts were severe. Early farmers show clear evidence of nutritional deficiencies in their skeletons. Lack of dietary diversity meant lack of essential nutrients. Teeth show more cavities from high-carbohydrate grain diets. Bones show evidence of harder physical labour, stress fractures, arthritis, signs of repetitive strain. Life expectancy actually dropped with the adoption of agriculture in many regions, not by a little bit, by years. The diseases associated with settled living, infectious diseases that spread in permanent settlements with poor sanitation, killed people who would have survived in the more dispersed hunter-gatherer populations. Violence increased. The skeletal evidence shows more traumatic injuries, more signs of warfare, more mass graves with evidence of violent death. Agriculture created something worth fighting over. Land, stored food, territorial boundaries. Hunter-gatherers, with their mobile lifestyle and lack of stored wealth, had less to fight about. So let's be very clear about this. By every measurable indicator of quality of life, health, nutrition, leisure time, freedom of movement, lifespan, violence levels, Early farming was worse than hunting and gathering, demonstrably worse, not speculation, archaeological fact. And yet humans adopted it, not in one place, but in multiple locations around the world, at roughly the same time in human history. Why? Why would people adopt a lifestyle that was demonstrably harder, more constraining, less healthy than what they'd been doing for hundreds of thousands of years? Because they had to. Because the world that had supported hunter-gathering for so long had fundamentally changed. Because the end of the Ice Age had created conditions where the old strategies no longer worked. Because environmental catastrophe had eliminated the option of continuing as hunter-gatherers, leaving agriculture as the only viable alternative even though it was a worse option. Let me walk you through exactly how this happened. How environmental catastrophe forced humans to invent agriculture, not as a choice but as a desperate necessity. We've already talked about the megafauna extinctions, how the giant animals that had been reliable protein sources disappeared between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths all gone. More than 80% of large mammal species in the Americas extinct. Significant losses in Europe and Asia. Australia's megafauna decimated. This created an immediate crisis for human populations that had depended on megafauna hunting. You can't just switch from hunting animals that provide thousands of pounds of meat per kill to hunting rabbits that provide a few pounds and expect to get the same caloric return. The energy investment is completely different. The success rate is different. The social organisation required is different. Everything has to change. So populations adapted by diversifying. You start hunting smaller game, deer, wild pigs, rabbits. You increase fishing, developing better nets, weirs, hooks. You gather more plant resources, nuts, seeds, roots, berries. You become what archaeologists call broad-spectrum foragers, people who use a wide variety of resources rather than specialising in a few large prey animals. This is exactly what we see in the archaeological record across the world after the megafauna extinctions. Sites show increased use of fish bones, shellfish remains, small mammal bones, bird bones. Grinding stones for processing seeds become more common. Evidence of extensive plant gathering increases. The toolkit diversifies to handle more varied resources. The diet becomes broader. But there's a fundamental problem with broad-spectrum foraging. It requires larger territories. Much larger. If you're hunting mammoths, one successful kill might feed a group of 20 to 30 people for weeks. You can establish a base camp and stay relatively stationary while the meat lasts. Your territorial range can be relatively compact because you're targeting high-return resources. But if you're hunting rabbits and gathering seeds and fishing and collecting shellfish, you need to constantly move. A rabbit warren might feed your group for a day or two, then it's depleted. A grove of nut trees might be productive for a few weeks per year, but you need access to multiple groves. A shellfish bed can be harvested intensively for a short period, then needs time to recover. To get the same total calories that you used to get from megafauna hunting, you need access to vastly more territory. You need to range more widely. You need larger areas to sustain the same population. And here's where the catastrophic timing comes in. Because remember what else is happening at the end of the Ice Age. The rising seas are drowning coastal territories. The coastlines of every continent are retreating inland. Land area is shrinking. The exposed continental shelves that had provided enormous amounts of territory during the Ice Age, places like Doggerland, Sunda, Beringia, all of them are disappearing beneath the waves. So you have populations that need more territory per person, because megafauna hunting is no longer viable, and broad-spectrum foraging requires larger ranges. But simultaneously you have less total territory available because the seas are rising and drowning the coasts. The equation doesn't balance anymore. Population density increases not necessarily because populations are growing, though they might be, but because the denominator is shrinking. The same number of people compressed into less space, and each person needs more space than before. This is the definition of unsustainable. This is population pressure in its most literal sense. And it gets worse, because the changing climate is also affecting the distribution of wild resources. As the ice melts and climate zones shift, plant and animal species migrate. The species that Ice Age hunter-gatherers had relied on moved to different locations or changed their distributions. The predictable seasonal patterns get disrupted. Resources that used to be reliably available at specific times and places become less reliable. Some regions experience this more severely than others. The Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, is a particularly clear example. During the Ice Age, this region was relatively cold and dry, but it was stable. The wild wheat and barley that grew there existed in scattered stands. Hunter-gatherers harvested them as part of their broad-spectrum foraging along with gazelles, wild sheep, fish, dozens of other resources. Then the climate began to warm and shift. The younger dryers reversed things for a while, then warming resumed. The distribution of wild cereals changed. Some areas became more productive, others less so. The predictability decreased. The reliable patterns broke down, and human populations in the region were already under pressure. Territory shrinking from rising Mediterranean sea levels, megafauna gone or in severe decline, population density increasing, competition for resources intensifying. In this context, certain wild plants become increasingly important. Wild wheat and barley have particular characteristics that make them attractive under pressure. They produce relatively large seeds. The seeds are calorie-dense. They grow in fairly dense stands once established. And critically, they can be stored for extended periods without spoiling. When other resources are unreliable, when territory is limited, when population pressure is high, these storable, calorie-dense plants become more valuable. People start paying more attention to them, protecting productive stands, returning to the same locations year after year, eventually deliberately encouraging them. This is proto-agriculture. Not full farming yet, but the beginning of a different relationship with certain plant species. Management rather than simple gathering. Intentional intervention to increase productivity. And this is happening around the same time in multiple locations around the world. The Middle East around 10,000 to 11,000 years ago. China around 9,000 years ago. Mesoamerica around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. The Andes around 8,000 years ago. Sub-Saharan Africa around 5,000 years ago. New Guinea around 9,000 years ago. Independent developments, different plants, different environmental contexts, but similar trajectories. Broad spectrum, foraging, intensifying into plant management, intensifying into full agriculture. Why? Why did this happen in multiple places at roughly the same time in human history? Not because humans suddenly got smarter, not because someone had a brilliant idea, but because they were all responding to the same pressures. Environmental transformation, megafauna extinctions, shrinking territories from rising seas, population pressure, climate instability. The conditions that had made hunting and gathering viable for hundreds of thousands of years had changed fundamentally and globally. And humans were adapting the only way they could, by intensifying their use of plant resources that could be encouraged and eventually domesticated through cultivation. But here's the thing about agriculture. It's a trap. Once you start, you can't easily stop. Because farming creates conditions that make returning to hunting and gathering progressively more difficult. First, agriculture requires clearing land. You cut down forests or burn grasslands to create fields. This destroys habitat for wild animals and wild plants. Every hectare you convert to farmland is a hectare that no longer supports the diverse wild resources that hunter-gatherers depended on. The more you farm, the fewer wild resources remain available in the surrounding area. Second, agriculture supports higher population densities. A hectare of farmland can support more people than a hectare of wild territory. So populations grow, more people means more need for farmed food, means more land needs to be cleared, means even fewer wild resources remain available. Third, agriculture creates sedentism, permanent settlements. Once you're tied to your fields, you can't easily pick up and move to follow wild resources the way hunter-gatherers did seasonally. You've invested enormous labour in clearing, planting, building structures. You're committed to the location. Fourth, agriculture, because it depends on a few domesticated species, creates vulnerability to crop failure. This vulnerability creates pressure to produce surplus, to store food against bad years, but producing surplus requires even more agricultural intensification, more land clearing, more commitment to farming. And fifth, as populations grow and become dependent on agriculture, the specialised knowledge of hunting and gathering begins to erode. The children born into farming communities don't learn the tracking skills, the plant identification, the understanding of animal behaviour that hunter-gatherers possessed. That knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years, begins to be lost. So you have a ratchet effect. Each step toward agriculture makes the next step more necessary and makes going back more difficult. Clear some land to supplement gathering and wild resources decline. Supplement more with farming and population grows. Population grows and you need more farming. More farming and less wild territory remains. Less wild territory and you're fully dependent on farming, even though it's harder and less healthy than what you were doing before. This is the agricultural trap. Once you're in it, reversing becomes nearly impossible. The wild resources have been depleted or destroyed. The population is too large to support through hunting and gathering. The knowledge of effective hunting and gathering has been partially lost. The infrastructure of settled life has been built. You're committed to farming, even though, by every measure, it's worse than the lifestyle it replaced. And this is what happened at the end of the Ice Age. Humans didn't choose agriculture because it was better. They were forced into agriculture by environmental changes that made hunting and gathering unviable. Population pressure from shrinking territories, megafauna extinctions, climate instability affecting wild resource distribution. All of it creating conditions where agricultural intensification became the only option, even though it was a worse option. Once started, the trap closed. Populations became dependent. The old ways became impossible to return to, and humans were committed to agriculture and everything that came with it. Now let's talk about what agriculture created, because this is where things get really interesting from a civilizational perspective. Hunter-gatherers are necessarily mobile. They follow resources through seasonal rounds. This mobility prevents accumulation of material goods beyond what you can carry. It prevents significant wealth inequality. Everyone owns about the same amount because you can't carry much. It enforces relative egalitarianism because there's no material basis for hierarchy. But farmers are sedentary. They stay in one place year-round. This allows accumulation. Some families end up with better land or larger harvests. They can store surpluses. They can accumulate material goods beyond immediate needs. This creates inequality. For the first time in human history on a significant scale, some people have more than others. Not just slightly more, but substantially more. Wealth differences emerge, and with wealth differences come status differences. Farming also requires coordination. Planting has to happen at the right time. Irrigation systems need to be built and maintained. Harvests have to be organised. Stored grain needs to be managed and protected from pests and theft. This coordination creates roles. Someone has to organise the planting schedule. Someone has to allocate water from irrigation channels. Someone has to oversee grain storage. These coordinating roles create a class of people who manage rather than directly produce food. And farming creates surplus, or more food than the farmers themselves need. This surplus can support non-farmers, craftspeople who make better tools, traders who exchange goods between regions, warriors who protect stored food and territory, priests who maintain relationships with the gods who supposedly control harvest success, administrators who keep track of surpluses and coordinate their distribution. All of these specialized roles emerge from agricultural surplus, and suddenly you don't have simple egalitarian bands anymore. You have complex societies with social hierarchies, specialized roles, political organization. Agriculture leads to sedentism. Sedentism leads to accumulation. Accumulation leads to inequality. Inequality leads to hierarchy. Hierarchy leads to specialization. Specialization leads to political complexity. Political complexity leads to what we recognize as civilization. Cities, governments, writing systems to keep track of surpluses and allocate resources, mathematics to calculate areas and harvests, monumental architecture to demonstrate power and coordinate large labour forces, all of it emerging step by step from the initial adoption of agriculture. This isn't speculation. This is documented archaeological sequence. In every region where agriculture developed, you see the same progression. Small farming villages appear first, then larger settlements, then towns with evidence of specialization and hierarchy, then cities with monumental architecture and writing systems, then states with formal political structures, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes. Independent developments in different parts of the world, but all following similar trajectories from agriculture to civilization. And it all traces back to environmental catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age. The megafauna extinctions, the rising seas, the climate instability, the population pressure that forced adoption of agriculture even though agriculture was demonstrably worse than hunting and gathering by every quality of life measure. Think about what this means. The entire structure of human civilization, PTs, governments, writing, monumental architecture, specialized roles, social hierarchies, all of it emerged not from humans reaching for progress, but from humans responding to catastrophe. The Ice Age ended, the world transformed. The old ways stopped working. Humans innovated out of necessity. The innovation was agriculture. Agriculture was costly, harder work, poorer health, more violence, more inequality, loss of freedom, but it allowed survival in a transformed world. And once adopted, it created conditions that made civilization almost inevitable. This is one of the great ironies of human history. The development of civilization, which we think of as humanity's crowning achievement, was actually a series of adaptations to catastrophe. Each step was a response to problems created by previous steps. Each innovation created new challenges that required further innovation. Agriculture solved the problem of supporting populations when wild resources were inadequate. But agriculture created new problems: disease, inequality, warfare over land. These problems required solutions: medicine, governance, military organization. Those solutions created new complexity that required further innovation. And on, each solution creating new problems, each problem demanding new solutions, in an accelerating cycle. We're still in that cycle. Modern civilization, with all its complexity, is still at its core a series of responses to problems created by agriculture, which itself was a response to environmental catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age. And maybe, lying there tonight, you can see how this matters for understanding where we are now. We're not the beneficiaries of linear progress from primitive to advanced. We're the inheritors of desperate adaptations to catastrophe. We carry the costs as well as the benefits, the hard work, the inequality, the diseases of civilization, the loss of freedoms that hunter-gatherers enjoyed. All of it traceable back to that moment when the Ice Age ended and humans had to figure out new ways to survive. This isn't cause for despair, it's cause for understanding. Understanding that progress and catastrophe are often intertwined. That innovations born from crisis carry costs as well as benefits. That we're not moving towards some perfect future but constantly adapting to problems, many of them created by our previous solutions. Your ancestors at the end of the Ice Age faced the greatest environmental catastrophe in human history. They survived, but survival required sacrifices, required abandoning the successful hunting and gathering adaptation that had sustained humans for hundreds of thousands of years, required accepting agriculture even though it made them less healthy, less free, harder working, required accepting social hierarchy and political complexity even though it created inequality and conflict. These weren't choices made freely. These were responses to necessity. adaptations to a world that had fundamentally changed, the best available options in a situation where all options were bad. And yet they persisted. They found ways to continue. They built new societies from the ruins of the old world. They created stability from chaos. They found meaning in the midst of catastrophe. They continued having children, passing knowledge forward, believing that life was worth living even in a world that had become fundamentally harder. This capacity for persistence in the face of necessity, this willingness to pay enormous costs for survival, this refusal to give up even when the future is uncertain and the present is hard, this is part of your inheritance. You carry the resilience of people who survived the end of the Ice Age, who watched their world transform in every possible way, who lost the old ways and had to invent new ones, who succeeded not because they were superhuman, but because they were adaptable, persistent, and willing to do whatever was necessary to continue. The innovations they made, agriculture, sedentism, civilization, we're still living with the consequences, both the benefits and the costs, the abundance and the inequality, the specialization and the alienation, the technological advancement and the environmental degradation, the medicine and the epidemic disease, the art and the warfare. All of it traces back to that moment when the Ice Age ended and humans had to figure out how to survive in a fundamentally transformed world. They made choices, hard choices, costly choices, and those choices created the trajectory we're still following. Tomorrow you can think about what this means for understanding your own life, your own civilization, your own responses to crisis. Tonight, you can rest knowing that your ancestors navigated transformations more dramatic than anything in recorded history. They made it through, they adapted, they continued, and so can you, because you carry their adaptability, their persistence, their capacity to face catastrophe and find ways to survive, even when survival is costly, even when the solutions create new problems, even when the future is uncertain. The Ice Age is over. The catastrophes have passed. But the human capacity for adaptation, forged in the fires of environmental transformation and agricultural intensification, that remains in you, in everyone trying to navigate a changing world, in the eternal human story of responding to crisis with innovation, even when innovation comes at a cost. Sleep now. The ancient transformations are complete. The sacrifices have been made. The innovations have emerged, and from catastrophe came agriculture. From agriculture came civilization. From crisis came complexity. That's your inheritance. Crisis and innovation. Catastrophe and adaptation. The end of one world and the difficult, costly birth of another. Costs and benefits intertwined. Progress and loss inseparable. And through it all, the persistence of the human spirit. Finding ways to continue even when continuation requires sacrifice. Adapting even when adaptation is painful. Surviving even when survival means accepting conditions worse than what came before. Rest now. You come from people who survived the impossible, who paid enormous costs for that survival, who created civilization not because it was better, but because it was necessary. That survival, that adaptation, that costly persistence, it lives in you. As the night deepens around you now, as you've journeyed with me through the end of the Ice Age, through melting glaciers and rising seas and transforming climates and dying megafauna and the desperate invention of agriculture, you might be thinking, this is all catastrophe, all loss, all trauma. Where's the hope in this story? And I understand that feeling. We've spent hours looking at how the end of the Ice Age was fundamentally catastrophic for the humans who lived through it. How it destroyed familiar landscapes, forced population displacements, made old knowledge obsolete, required painful adaptations. How agriculture wasn't progress but crisis response. How it trapped humans in new ways of living that were harder and less healthy than what came before. That's all true, but it's not the whole truth, because catastrophe, as devastating as it is, also creates something. Not despite the pain, but because of it. And the humans who survived the end of the Ice Age didn't just survive, they became something new. They developed capacities that didn't exist before. They created possibilities that wouldn't have emerged without the pressure of catastrophic change. So let's talk about the gifts. Not to minimize the trauma or pretend it wasn't real, but to see the full picture. To understand what emerged from crisis that couldn't have emerged any other way. The first gift is radical adaptability. Not the capacity to adapt, humans had that before the Ice Age ended, but rapid, fundamental adaptability. The ability to transform yourself and your culture within a single generation when circumstances demand it. Your Ice Age ancestors were adaptable, yes. They had to be to survive glacial conditions, but that adaptation happened slowly, over thousands of years. Cultural practices evolved gradually. Technologies improved incrementally. Each generation passed knowledge to the next, and the changes were small enough that the core way of life remained stable. But the end of the Ice Age didn't allow for slow adaptation. The changes came too fast. Within a single lifetime, the environment could transform so dramatically that everything you'd learned as a child might be obsolete by the time you were elderly. The coastline could move miles inland. The climate could shift from cold and dry to warm and wet. The familiar animals could disappear and be replaced by new species. This required a different kind of adaptability. Not gradual refinement, but radical transformation. The ability to look at all your accumulated knowledge and say, this doesn't work anymore. I need to start over. I need to learn completely new strategies. And then actually do it, despite the psychological cost, despite the fear, despite everything in you that wants to cling to the familiar. The humans who survived were the ones who could do this, who could abandon expertise and become novices again, who could watch their parents' knowledge become useless and find new knowledge instead, who could rebuild their entire worldview to match a world that bore little resemblance to the one they were born into. This capacity, this radical adaptability, it's still with you. Modern humans are extraordinarily good at learning new things quickly, at abandoning strategies that no longer work, at thriving in completely unfamiliar environments. We think this is just how humans are, but it's how humans became under specific pressures during the most rapid environmental transformation our species has ever experienced. And this matters because you live in a time of rapid change. Technologies shift, social structures transform, the certainties of one generation become outdated in the next. The skills that got you your first job might be obsolete before you retire. The world you were born into might be substantially different from the world you'll die in. And you can handle this. Not because you're special, but because you inherited the capacity for radical adaptability from people who had no choice but to develop it. When your world changes too fast to keep up, when old knowledge becomes obsolete, when you have to learn new ways of being, you're doing what your ancestors did, following in footsteps tens of thousands of years old. The second gift is cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold multiple, sometimes contradictory possibilities in your mind simultaneously, to plan for different potential futures rather than committing rigidly to a single expected outcome. Ice Age humans before the terminal melt could largely rely on environmental stability. The climate was harsh but predictable within its range. The seasons followed known patterns. The resources were where they'd always been, give or take normal variation. You could learn how the world worked, and that knowledge would remain reliable throughout your life. But during the terminal Ice Age, reliability disappeared. The climate oscillated wildly, warming, then the younger dryers cooling, then rapid warming again. Resources appeared in new locations and vanished from old ones. What worked last year might not work this year. What worked this year might not work next year. Planning for a single future became dangerous because the future might turn out to be completely different from what you expected. This forced the development of probabilistic thinking. Instead of, the rains will come in spring and we'll plant here, it became, the rains might come in spring, or they might not, or they might come at a different time, so we need plans for multiple possibilities. Instead of, we'll hunt at the valley because game is always there, it became, we'll check the valley, but we should also scout other locations because the game patterns are shifting. This is cognitive flexibility at a fundamental level. The ability to simultaneously prepare for multiple outcomes, to invest in diverse strategies, to maintain options rather than committing fully to single paths, to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. And this capacity became encoded in human psychology. We became, as a species, exceptionally good at scenario planning, at maintaining backup plans, at hedging our bets, at thinking in terms of probabilities rather than certainties. You use this every day when you make contingency plans, when you consider what-if scenarios, when you prepare for multiple possible outcomes of a situation, when you can shift strategies mid-course without it feeling like total failure. You're using cognitive flexibility developed by ancestors who had no choice but to think this way because environmental certainty had vanished. The third gift is enhanced cultural memory, the ability to preserve knowledge across generations even when that knowledge isn't immediately useful, to maintain stories and practices and understanding from the past even when the present seems to make them obsolete. During stable Ice Age periods, knowledge was immediately practical. You learned what you needed to survive in current conditions. If those conditions remained stable, that knowledge stayed relevant. There was less pressure to preserve information about different conditions because those conditions weren't expected to return. But the end of the Ice Age changed this calculation completely. Suddenly, conditions could shift dramatically and then shift back. The knowledge from your grandparents' time might become irrelevant, then relevant again a generation later. The stories about how things used to be weren't just nostalgia, so they were potentially vital information about conditions that might return. This created powerful selection pressure for better cultural memory systems, for preserving knowledge not just about current conditions but about past conditions and potential future conditions, for maintaining oral traditions that could transmit complex information across multiple generations. The flood myths we discussed earlier are perfect examples. Stories about lands that drowned, about catastrophic waters, about worlds that existed before the current world. These stories preserved actual historical memory of real events, real coastlines, real landscapes, real transformations, and they persisted for thousands of years, passed down orally through countless generations, because cultures had learned that the past mattered, that what had happened before might happen again, that knowledge from ancestors who lived in different conditions could be life-saving. This is the foundation of complex human culture, the ability to accumulate knowledge across generations, to learn from experiences of people long dead, to maintain understanding of conditions we haven't personally witnessed. All of this became crucial during the terminal Ice Age, when environmental conditions were too variable for any single generation's experience to be sufficient. You benefit from this inheritance constantly. Every piece of knowledge you possess that you didn't learn through direct experience, reading, education, history, science, cultural practices, all of it depends on this capacity to preserve and transmit information across time. A capacity that was honed and refined during the end of the Ice Age when rapid environmental change made cultural memory a survival necessity. The fourth gift is community resilience, the deep understanding that survival depends not just on individual strength but on collective cooperation, on maintaining social bonds even when resources are scarce and conditions are difficult. Hunter-gatherer societies have always valued cooperation to some degree, but the end of the Ice Age intensified this dramatically. When megafauna disappeared, hunting smaller game required more coordinated group efforts. When territories shrank due to rising seas, populations were compressed and had to develop more sophisticated systems for managing resources and resolving conflicts without destroying the social fabric. And when environmental conditions became unstable, when droughts or floods or temperature swings could devastate food sources unpredictably, communities learned through painful experience that groups who shared resources and supported each other through hard times survived, while groups that prioritized individual accumulation and competition often didn't. This created powerful selection pressure for social cohesion, for cultures that valued helping others even at personal cost, for sharing norms that prevented some members from accumulating resources while others starved, for collaborative decision-making that drew on collective wisdom rather than individual authority, for maintaining group solidarity even during periods of severe resource stress. These aren't just nice ethical values, they're survival strategies forged under extreme conditions. Communities that could maintain cooperation during crisis survived. Communities that fractured under stress died out. And the descendants of the surviving communities carried forward the cultural emphasis on mutual aid and collective resilience. This is still with you, the understanding that you're stronger together than apart, that community resilience matters more than individual strength alone, that cooperation is as important to survival as competition, perhaps more so during difficult times, when you help others even when it costs you something, when you share even when you could hoard, when you work together toward collective goals rather than purely individual ones, when you maintain relationships even when they're not immediately profitable. You're following patterns established by people who learned through brutal experience that cooperation was often the difference between survival and extinction. The fifth gift is environmental awareness, the profound understanding that humans are not separate from nature but embedded in it, that environmental conditions fundamentally affect human well-being, that changes to climate and landscape have cascading impacts on human societies. Before the Ice Age ended, environmental awareness existed, but it was relatively straightforward. Learn the seasonal patterns of your region, understand where resources can be found, track the movements of game animals, adapt to the cold. That knowledge was sufficient for relatively stable conditions, but the terminal ice age demanded much more sophisticated environmental literacy. You had to track not just current conditions, but trends over years and decades. Notice not just where resources currently are, but predict where they might move as conditions changed. Understand not just seasonal patterns, but longer-term climate oscillations. Read not just obvious signs, but subtle indicators of coming transformations. The people who developed this sophisticated environmental awareness had survival advantages. They noticed when sea levels were rising faster than normal and moved settlements before catastrophic flooding. They recognized when climate patterns were shifting and adapted subsistence strategies accordingly. They read landscapes for signs of coming changes, shifts in vegetation, changes in animal behavior, alterations in water flow, and prepared rather than being caught off guard. This deep environmental literacy became encoded in cultural knowledge, in the ability to read weather signs, to predict seasonal changes, to understand the interconnections between climate, vegetation, animal populations, and human survival. To see yourself not as separate from nature but as part of a complex, interconnected system where changes in one element affect everything else. This capacity was partially lost during the long stable period of the Holocene, when environmental conditions became more predictable and that level of awareness seemed less necessary. But it's being recovered now as environmental conditions become less stable again. The modern environmental movement, the growing awareness that human activities affect climate and that climate change affects human well-being, this isn't entirely new wisdom. It's the recovery of ancient understanding that was absolutely essential during the terminal ice age. You carry this awareness, the knowledge that environmental conditions matter fundamentally, that climate isn't just background to human life but shapes everything about how humans can live, that changes to the natural world have profound consequences for human societies. This isn't just intellectual knowledge acquired from modern science. It's ancestral wisdom, preserved through cultural memory from a time when ignoring environmental change was fatal. Now let's talk about what carrying these gifts actually means for you. Lying there tonight, trying to make sense of your own life in your own time. First, it means you're more resilient than you think you are. When you face changes that feel overwhelming, when the world seems to be transforming too fast to handle, when you feel like you can't adapt quickly enough to keep up, remember this. You carry the radical adaptability of people who survived the end of the Ice Age, who watched their entire world transform, coastlines, climate, resources, everything, and found ways to continue. You have that same capacity built into your psychology through thousands of generations of selection pressure. You're not fragile. You're the descendant of people who survived catastrophes that would have destroyed less adaptable species. That resilience is in you, whether you feel it or not. Second, it means uncertainty is manageable. The cognitive flexibility you inherited allows you to function in unpredictable conditions. You don't need perfect certainty to move forward. You don't need to know exactly what the future holds. You can maintain multiple possibilities in mind, adapt as conditions change, adjust your plans when reality doesn't match expectations. This isn't weakness or indecisiveness. It's sophisticated cognitive machinery specifically evolved for navigating unstable, unpredictable conditions. When you feel paralyzed by uncertainty, when you can't predict what will happen, when the future seems opaque, you can trust that you have the mental tools to handle this. Your ancestors faced far greater uncertainty, literally watching the world transform in ways they had no framework to understand, and they managed. You can too. Third, it means you're connected to something larger than yourself, of the cultural memory capacity that allowed your ancestors to preserve knowledge across generations. That same capacity connects you backward to everyone who came before and forward to everyone who will come after. You're not starting from zero. You inherit accumulated understanding from thousands of years of human experience. And what you learn, what you discover, what you understand, you can pass forward to those who follow. You're part of an unbroken chain of knowledge transmission that stretches back to the Ice Age and extends forward into futures you won't live to see. That's not just poetic. It's literal. The knowledge you carry, you received from the past. The knowledge you transmit, someone in the future will build upon. You're a link in a chain that's been unbroken for 10,000 years. Fourth, it means you're not meant to survive alone. The community resilience developed during the terminal Ice Age taught humans at a deep level that cooperation isn't optional. It's essential. When you struggle, reaching out for help isn't weakness. It's activation of an ancient survival strategy. When you help others, even at cost to yourself, you're strengthening the social bonds that make communities resilient to crisis. You're wired for mutual aid, for collective survival, for understanding that when the group survives, you survive. This isn't just ethics. It's evolutionary strategy proven effective through thousands of years of environmental catastrophe. And fifth, it means your environmental concerns aren't irrational anxiety. The worry you might feel about climate change, about environmental degradation, about the transformation of natural systems, this isn't neurosis. It's ancient wisdom reasserting itself. It's the reactivation of awareness that was crucial during the last major environmental transformation humans experienced. Your ancestors who paid attention to environmental change, who worried about shifting conditions, who took seriously the signs of transformation, they were the ones who survived. The ones who ignored environmental signals, who assumed stability, who didn't adapt to changing conditions, they didn't leave descendants. You carry the genes and cultural inheritance of the people who worried, who paid attention, who took environmental change seriously. So when you feel concerned about environmental conditions, you're not being paranoid. You're listening to very old wisdom that knows, at a deep level, that environmental transformation matters, that it has consequences, that ignoring it is dangerous. Now, having said all of that, having walked through the catastrophes and the adaptations and the gifts that emerged, let me be honest with you about something. This doesn't make the catastrophes okay. The fact that gifts emerged doesn't mean the pain wasn't real. The fact that humans survived doesn't mean the losses weren't devastating. The fact that civilization emerged from crisis doesn't mean the costs weren't enormous. The people who lived through the end of the Ice Age suffered. They watched their world drown. They saw familiar landscapes disappear. They lost knowledge that had sustained their ancestors for thousands of years. They were forced into ways of life that were harder and less healthy than what came before. They experienced trauma on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. And that trauma was real. The gifts don't erase it. The resilience doesn't negate it. The survival doesn't make it disappear. What the gifts mean is that humans can emerge from catastrophe changed but not destroyed, damaged but not broken, carrying scars but still capable of continuing. This is important to understand because you might be carrying your own catastrophes, your own losses, your own transformations that you didn't choose and didn't want. And the fact that you can survive them, that you can adapt to them, that gifts might eventually emerge from them, that doesn't make them okay. That doesn't mean you should be grateful for the pain. That doesn't mean the suffering was somehow worth it. It just means that survival is possible, that adaptation is real, that humans have a remarkable capacity to continue even after everything familiar has been destroyed. Your ancestors didn't survive the end of the Ice Age because they were grateful for the catastrophe. They survived despite the catastrophe, through it, in spite of it. They survived because they had no choice but to continue, and because something in the human spirit refuses to give up even when continuation is costly and painful. You have that same spirit, that same stubborn persistence, that same refusal to be completely destroyed by circumstances beyond your control, and maybe tonight, you can make peace with that. Not peace with the catastrophes themselves, but peace with the fact that you can survive them, that you carry the tools, radical adaptability, cognitive flexibility, cultural memory, community resilience, environmental awareness, that make survival possible even when it seems impossible. You don't have to be happy about difficult circumstances. You don't have to pretend that hard things are actually good. You don't have to find silver linings in genuine suffering, but you can trust that you have the capacity to get through it, to adapt, to continue, to find ways forward even when the path isn't clear and the future is uncertain, because you come from people who did exactly that, who faced the end of their world and continued anyway, who lost everything familiar and still found reasons to go on, who survived catastrophes that should have been unsurvivable through sheer stubborn persistence and remarkable adaptability. That's your inheritance. Not just the gifts, but the capacity to continue carrying them. The willingness to keep going even when going is hard. The refusal to be completely destroyed by transformation, even when transformation is painful. As you're lying there now, in the deep hours of the night, perhaps you can feel that inheritance settling around you like a blanket. The knowledge that you're connected to 10,000 years of survivors, of adapters, of people who faced impossible circumstances and found possible ways through them. The Ice Age ended 11,000 years ago. The catastrophes are over. The Great Melt is complete. The seas have stabilized. The climate has settled. The megafauna are gone and won't return. The agricultural trap has closed and civilization has emerged from it. But the human capacity to survive transformation, to adapt to catastrophic change, to continue despite costs, that hasn't ended. That continues. In you, in everyone alive today, in everyone who will live in the future. You carry the resilience of everyone who survived the end of the Ice Age. Their radical adaptability is your radical adaptability. Their cognitive flexibility is your cognitive flexibility. Their cultural memory is your cultural memory. Their community resilience is your community resilience. Their environmental awareness is your environmental awareness. These aren't metaphors. These are literal inheritances. Psychological capacities shaped by 10,000 years of selection pressure. Cultural practices refined by millennia of transmission. Neurological patterns encoded through countless generations of survival under catastrophic conditions. And these capacities don't just sit dormant. They activate when you need them. When your world changes too fast. When old strategies stop working. When you face uncertainty and loss. When you need to adapt to circumstances you didn't choose. In those moments, you're not alone. You're drawing on resources accumulated over 10,000 years. You're accessing wisdom tested under the most extreme conditions humans have ever faced. You're activating capacities that were forged in catastrophe and refined through millennia of use. This is what it means to be human after the Ice Age. To carry this inheritance of survival through transformation. To possess these tools for navigating change. to be connected to this long chain of adapters and survivors and continuers. Tomorrow you can think about what this means for your own life, for your own challenges, for your own transformations, for how you navigate change and loss and uncertainty. But tonight, you can rest. The ancient catastrophes are over. The great transformations are complete. Your ancestors survived the end of one world and the difficult birth of another, and they passed forward to you everything they learned about how to survive transformation. You don't have to do anything with this knowledge tonight. You don't have to apply it or use it or make meaning from it. You can just let it be. Let it hell. Let it become part of how you understand yourself and where you come from. You are the descendant of survivors of the greatest environmental catastrophe in human history. They survived. And in surviving, they created you. Everything they learned about adaptation and resilience and continuation, they passed forward through 10,000 years of transmission, through countless generations, all the way to you. That's not a small thing, that's remarkable. That you exist at all means that every single one of your ancestors, going back to the Ice Age and beyond, survived long enough to reproduce. Every single one navigated their own catastrophes, their own losses, their own transformations, and every single one found ways to continue. You come from an unbroken line of continuers, of adapters, of survivors. That's in your blood, in your bones, in your psychology, in your cultural inheritance. And whatever you're facing, whatever transformations you're navigating, whatever losses you're experiencing, you have access to 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom about how to survive change. It's there, in you, available when you need it. So rest now, the long night is ending. The ancient transformations are complete. The Ice Age is over and the world has stabilized and humans have survived and adapted and continued. And you, lying there in the darkness, you're the proof. The evidence that survival is possible, that adaptation works, that continuation, however costly, however difficult, however painful, is achievable. Your ancestors survived the end of the Ice Age. They watched glaciers collapse and seas rise and climates transform and megafauna disappear and old ways become impossible. They lost their world and had to build new ways of living from the ruins, and they did it. They survived. They adapted. They continued. They passed forward their knowledge and their resilience and their stubborn refusal to be destroyed by circumstances. That's your inheritance from 10,000 years ago, from people who face catastrophes you'll never experience, who survived conditions you can't imagine, who adapted to transformations that would seem apocalyptic to anyone living through them. And they did it so that you could be here, so that their line could continue, so that all their accumulated wisdom about survival and adaptation and resilience could reach you 10,000 years later when you might need it. Sleep now. The ancient catastrophes are over. The great transformations are complete. But the human capacity for survival through change, for adaptation to new conditions, for continuation despite costs, that remains. In you, in everyone. In the eternal human story of facing impossible circumstances and finding possible ways through them. You carry 10,000 years of survival, 10,000 years of adaptation, 10,000 years of continuation despite catastrophe. That's who you are. That's where you come from. That's what lives in you. Rest now. The Ice Age is over. The world has stabilized. And you, descendant of survivors, you can rest in the knowledge that you carry everything you need to face whatever transformations come next. Your ancestors would be proud. They survived so that you could exist. They adapted so that you could inherit their resilience. They continued so that their line could reach you. And now you carry it forward. That unbroken chain of survival, that 10,000-year inheritance of adaptation and resilience and continuation. Sleep well, descendant of survivors. Sleep well, carrier of ancient resilience. Sleep well, inheritor of 10,000 years of wisdom about how to survive transformation. The Ice Age is over. The catastrophes have passed. But the human capacity to survive them, to adapt to them, to continue despite them, that endures. In you. Good night.